The secret stories buried beneath Berlin's ruins. What really happened in April 1945? April 1945. Europe's greatest war is in its final, shuddering days. The air smells of smoke and ruin. The streets echo with distant gunfire. And in Berlin, the once proud capital of the Third Reich, the end has begun. But this is no quiet surrender. It will be a fight to the death, a battle that will decide the fate of a continent. For decades, we have seen the black and white images, soldiers in tattered uniforms, tanks rumbling through shattered streets, a red flag flying above the ruins. Yet behind those iconic photographs lies a story far more vivid, far more human, a story of hunger, fear, and stubborn defiance. In this rare journey back in time, we will see Berlin's fall in restored color and hear the voices of those who lived it. We will walk the last streets defended by boys and old men. We will witness the clash of giants, Zhukov and Konev racing to claim the city. And we will uncover the lesser-known moments that shaped the final chapter of World War II. This is not just the story of a battle. It is the story of a capital's last heartbeat. By the spring of 1945, the outcome of the Second World War in Europe was beyond doubt. To the south, Allied troops were pushing up through Italy. In the west, American, British, and Canadian forces had smashed through the Rhine and were advancing deep into Germany. In the east, the Red Army loomed like an unstoppable tide, having driven the Wehrmacht back from the gates of Moscow to the very doorstep of Berlin. But Adolf Hitler refused to surrender. Convinced that one last miracle could turn the tide, he ordered his final reserves into the east, hoping to halt the Soviet advance. It was a futile gamble. The Soviet plan Operation Berlin was already in motion, a massive assault designed to cross the Oder and Neisse rivers, encircle the German capital, and crush the last remnants of the Third Reich. The attacking force was unprecedented. Nearly 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, supported by 6,000 tanks and a storm of artillery, advanced in three great army groups. Two of these, the First Belarusian Front under Marshal Georgy Zhukov and the First Ukrainian Front under Marshal Ivan Konev, would compete for the honor of capturing Berlin itself. The Germans, though hopelessly outmatched, prepared to defend their capital at all costs. Roughly 1 million troops, a mixture of battle-hardened veterans, wounded men, poorly trained conscripts, and Hitler youth boys were deployed along the Oder-Neisse line. Their supplies were scarce, their fuel reserves critically low, and their weapons outdated. Yet, driven by fear of Soviet revenge, many were ready to fight to the last. The decisive opening came at the Seelow Heights, 60 kilometers east of Berlin. For 4 days, Soviet troops battled entrenched German defenders in one of the bloodiest clashes of the war, losing 66,000 men before finally breaking through. On the 21st of April, 1945, the road to Berlin lay open, and the city's final ordeal began. This was no ordinary siege. It was a race between two Soviet commanders, a last stand by a collapsing regime, and a desperate fight in which civilians, soldiers, and rubble-strewn streets all became part of the battlefield. The ring closes. With the fall of the Seelow Heights, Zhukov's armored columns surged forward, bent on surrounding Berlin. The Germans had transformed the approaches to the city into a patchwork of defensive lines, anti-tank ditches, rubble barricades, and hastily dug trenches. Army Group Vistula, the 4th Panzer Army, and the Berlin garrison formed the core of this defense, totaling about 750,000 troops. On paper, they still had 1,519 tanks and assault guns, over 9,300 artillery pieces, and 2,200 aircraft. In reality, many of these weapons lacked fuel or ammunition, and the soldiers themselves were a fragile mix of veterans, the wounded, and inexperienced recruits. About 60,000 were Volkssturm militia, elderly men and boys, barely capable of holding a rifle. In the south, Konev's First Ukrainian Front advanced rapidly. Initially ordered to bypass the city, he was redirected by Stalin himself when Zhukov's progress slowed. On the 25th of April, 1945, Soviet forces from north, east, and south met, sealing Berlin inside a steel ring of 1.5 million Red Army troops. The siege had begun. Life inside the fortress. Inside the city, the scene was chaos. Refugees poured in from the surrounding countryside, fleeing the Soviet advance. Allied bombing had already left Berlin a skeletal shadow of its former self. Now Soviet artillery pounded it day and night. Once, Grand boulevards were buried under rubble, the air thick with dust and smoke. Around 2.5 million civilians were trapped in the city. Many lived underground in basements or improvised bunkers, emerging only to search for food or water. Supplies were dwindling. Hygiene was almost non-existent. The Nazi leadership focused on frantic last-minute defenses, leaving the population to fend for themselves. The city was divided into defensive zones, with Zone Z, the government quarter, as the last bastion. Anti-tank trenches, roadblocks, and barricades of overturned trams offered little real protection. The men holding them were often too old, too young, or too exhausted to resist for long. Urban warfare at its deadliest. For the Red Army, Berlin was no easy prize. The city's waterways, bridges, and broad avenues created natural choke points. Snipers lurked in high windows, hidden machine guns raked open streets. Soviet tank crews knew that moving without infantry support meant certain destruction, but the Soviets had learned the art of city fighting. Heavy artillery like the 203mm howitzer was wheeled into the streets to obliterate entire buildings before the infantry advanced. Tanks and troops then cleared each block methodically with grenades, flamethrowers, and relentless gunfire, moving house by house, room by room. By the 30th of April, Soviet troops had crossed the Moltke Bridge and seized much of the Interior Ministry and the diplomatic quarter. Ahead lay one of the most symbolic and heavily defended positions in the city, the Reichstag, the last stand at the Reichstag and Hitler's final hours. Approaching the Reichstag was more than a building, it was a symbol. To the Soviets, capturing it meant proclaiming the death of Nazi Germany. To the defenders, holding it was a matter of pride, even in defeat. Trenches, sandbagged firing points, and 3 powerful 88mm guns guarded the approaches. Machine guns waited in every fortified window. One Soviet soldier preparing for the assault, Vladimir Perzveshchikov, wrote to his wife on the eve of the attack, "Up until now, I am alive and healthy, just a little drunk all the time, but that's necessary to keep courage. I am only 500 meters from the Reichstag. A 6-story building collapsed on top of us, and we had to dig our boys out. That's how we live, and how we will defeat the Germans." Zhukov's men launched their assault on the 30th of April. Progress was painfully slow. The defenders, a mix of hardened veterans, penal battalion soldiers, and Hitler youth, fought from every floor, every room. It took 3 more days of bitter combat for Soviet forces to break through. Collapse in the Führer bunker. While the Reichstag burned, a different drama unfolded beneath Berlin. In the Führer bunker, Hitler clung to fantasies of a rescue that would never come. News that Mussolini had been captured and executed hardened his resolve not to be taken alive. On the 29th of April, he married Eva Braun. Less than 40 hours later, they both took their own lives, she with cyanide, he with a gunshot to the head. Their bodies were burned in the Chancellery Garden as Soviet artillery thundered nearby. Joseph Goebbels, now Reich Chancellor for a single day, refused to surrender. That night, he and his wife poisoned their 6 children before killing themselves. The end of the defense. General Helmuth Weidling, in command of Berlin's defense, understood the futility. On May 2, 1945, at 6 a.m., he ordered all remaining German forces in the city to lay down their arms. The battle was over. In the ruins of the Reichstag, Soviet photographer Yevgeny Khalday staged the famous image of a Red Army soldier raising the flag over Berlin. The photograph, taken on or just after May 2, was later edited to remove a second watch from the soldier's wrist, a subtle sign of the looting that had followed the city's fall. The cost of victory and the shadow over Berlin. A victory paid in blood. The Red Army's triumph in Berlin came at a staggering price. In just weeks of fighting, the Soviets lost around 78,000 soldiers killed and over 274,000 wounded. German losses were similarly devastating, between 90,000 and 100,000 killed and at least 200,000 wounded. Civilian deaths, though harder to count, likely reached tens of thousands in those final days. But beyond the casualty lists lay the human cost. In the chaos following Berlin's fall, the Red Army, hardened by years of merciless warfare on the Eastern Front, unleashed waves of looting and revenge. Historians estimate that between 95,000 and 130,000 women in the city were raped, with some 10,000 later taking their own lives. For many Berliners, the liberation felt like another kind of devastation, a city in ruins. The Berlin that emerged from the battle was unrecognizable, Once grand streets like Unter den Linden were heaps of rubble, landmarks stood as hollowed shells, bridges lay broken in the Spree, their twisted metal reflecting in the river. The stench of smoke and death clung to the air. Yet for Soviet soldiers, the Reichstag became a pilgrimage site, a physical testament to victory. They carved their names into its stone walls, inscriptions that would still be visible when Western journalists arrived. The building, battered and blackened, became both a trophy and a memorial. The war's final echoes. 8 days after Berlin's surrender, on May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany signed its unconditional surrender. In Europe, the guns finally fell silent, but Berlin's scars, physical and emotional, would not fade quickly. The city was carved into occupation zones, setting the stage for a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. As one Soviet soldier later wrote, "The flame of the Second World War was extinguished there where it once arose, and in that flame's dying light, the 20th century entered a new and uncertain chapter." Little-known facts. The flag over the Reichstag, a staged triumph. Perhaps the most famous image of the entire Battle of Berlin is the Soviet flag raised above the Reichstag, captured by photographer Yevgeny Khalday. It has been printed in countless history books and documentaries, but few know the full story. The scene was staged. When Khalday arrived at the Reichstag, the real battle had already ended. The first flags had been raised earlier by Soviet soldiers in the chaos of May 1. Wanting an image worthy of history, Khalday brought his own large red flag, sewn from tablecloths, and asked soldiers to recreate the moment. Later, the photograph was retouched not for beauty, but to remove a politically awkward detail. On the wrist of one soldier, 2 watches were visible, a silent testament to battlefield looting. In the official version, one was erased, a final letter in the midst of destruction. Among the countless personal moments lost to history, one stands out, the letter written by Soviet soldier Vladimir Peresveshchikov from inside the Interior Ministry, just hours before the assault on the Reichstag. His words were not of strategy or politics, but of survival and raw determination. "I am only 500 meters from the Reichstag. A 6-story building collapsed on top of us, and we had to dig our boys out. That's how we live, and how we will defeat the Germans." The letter never made it home during the war, but it survives as a rare, human voice from the heart of the final battle. Berlin's inscriptions, a graffiti of victory. Long after the shooting stopped, the walls of the Reichstag bore hundreds of names carved by Soviet soldiers. These were not polished memorials, but rough, personal marks of conquest, names, dates, and even hometowns scratched into stone. They remained there for decades, silent witnesses to the day the old world ended. The Battle of Berlin was more than the final clash of World War II in Europe. It was the closing scene of an era defined by destruction, endurance, and unimaginable sacrifice. In just a few weeks, a city that had once stood as a symbol of power was reduced to ash and rubble. Armies numbering in the millions had converged on its streets, and the cost was measured not only in lives lost, but in the deep scars left on survivors. The fall of Berlin marked the end of the Third Reich, but it also marked the beginning of a divided city, a fractured Germany, and a new global struggle. The names carved into the Reichstag's walls, the letters never delivered, the staged yet iconic photograph all remain as fragments of a moment when history held its breath. For some, these events are lessons in the cost of war. For others, they are a personal memory or family story passed down through generations. And you, when you think of those final days in Berlin, what image comes to your mind first? The red flag above the ruins, the streets of rubble, or the silence that followed when the guns fell quiet?